This here is another viewer's broken gaming PC, and if I'm being completely honest, it's a PC that I built for my brother, and now it's on Fix or Flop. Today is October 25th, coincidentally, the day that Black Ops 6 officially launches. Kyle reached out to me because this happened the day before the launch, and he was sort of kind of panicking because he wanted to have the system up and running for that game, had it pre-downloaded, and was ready to go, only to run into an issue that I'll show you in video.
Oh, there goes the breaker.
Right, so what you just saw was a system not only abruptly powering off, but tripping an entire breaker in the process. The issue was so repeatable, in fact, that he managed to film it about the fourth time it happened. It just kept tripping the breaker over and over again, something that I've not personally seen before. As far as I'm aware, in this series, I've never seen a PC repeatedly trip a breaker like this, so I'm a little nervous going into it. But in addition to this recording, I of course had the benefit of being able to speak with my brother one-on-one, something I don't usually do with viewers for obvious reasons. We FaceTimed, I saw this with my own eyes over camera, and he also gave me a bit of context into what led up to the events you're seeing.
Yeah, so in preparation for Black Ops 6, I noticed my PC was a little dirty, so I wanted to get it a little bit better airflow, clean it up a little bit. So I took off some of the panels, removed a little bit of the covering, the filters, and just started vacuuming some of the dust that was on the outside.
You vacuumed it?
Yeah, I took a vacuum, was kind of getting some dust around the fan side here in the corner. Well, just like a little, HEPA vac, black shop, I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know vacuums create static, right?
No, mine plugged into the wall. It didn't use any batteries. It's safe. I don't know what to tell you, man. I didn't use any batteries. It came plugged straight into the wall, so it was grounded. I don't know what else to tell you. It just started acting up after.
It was grounded.
It was grounded. It was plugged in. It had all three prongs in, you know.
All three prongs.
Not just the two, but it also went into the middle one.
So yeah, as you can imagine, a bit of a time crunch with this game launching and Kyle expecting to be able to use this and running into an issue that he might have potentially created himself by vacuuming it. Now, I have seen static from a vacuum kill components before. It is very difficult to do in environments that are typically very humid, like anywhere in Florida, for example. Even inside of a home, unless you're running like tons of dehumidifiers, there's usually enough water in the air to prevent heavy static buildup, but a vacuum cleaner does accelerate a lot of that. And if certain components here were vacuumed, let's say around the power supply where capacitors might have still been charged, which I imagine they were because he was using the PC only minutes prior to vacuuming, then we could have a pretty serious issue on our hands. But we won't know more until we try powering it on for ourselves. And I'm crossing my fingers that my own breaker doesn't trip, but I'm still hopeful that we can fix it. I hope you'll stay with me. If you're planning your next PC build, then consider checking out our sponsor, VIP SCB Key. Their Windows 10 and 11 OEM keys sell for a fraction of retail and will unlock the full potential of your OS. They'll also remove those pesky activation watermarks. Click the links below to get started today, and be sure to use our special offer code SKGS for a sweet discount on a variety of options, including Windows 10 and 11, Pro and Home, and more. Hello there, and welcome to the first episode of Season 6 of Fix or Flop. I did not expect my brother to be contestant number 1 here, but it sounds like we've got a pretty big mess on our hands. Oh, and by the way, if you or someone you know has a broken computer and you want a chance to have it fixed for free on this channel, you can submit a form linked in this video's description in exchange for allowing us to film these videos. This is how we monetize stuff on sites like YouTube. We offer the service completely free of charge. We don't charge for labor nor replacement hardware. We can't choose everybody out there. We still have several in the queue who honestly probably won't get selected just because their issues are maybe super intermittent or they're software related. I only tend to focus on the things that I know I can fix very well, and that is usually hardware. This one, it sounds hardware related. I hope it is. All right, so we've got the power strip on. I've got the power supply connected. There's actually a cable that runs from the base of this chassis up to the unit itself, which is up here. Just keeps the wiring a bit cleaner. So I'm going to flip this switch on now. All right, so far so good. And we're gonna hit the power button. Okay, so far I'm not seeing any irregularity apart from maybe the fact that the fan in this power supply hasn't started spinning at all. It's also getting very loud. out of the gate. What did you say your temperatures were like in the BIOS?
90s.
CPU temperatures were in the 90s? That's Celsius?
Yep.
Oh wow, 78 degrees Celsius already after about 45 seconds or so of being fired up. This is not good. I wonder, I heard the pump spinning fluid, but I don't think we're getting good enough circulation to keep these temps down. The fan over the radiator is also spinning at pretty much full speed now. It's trying to work to dissipate that heat. I just don't think enough of it's being transferred away from the CPU and the cold plate, so we might have a clogged AIO on our hands. The BIOS at least is confirming that the pump is running at just over 4,000 RPM. That's normal, pretty much full blast for a smaller model like this. But yeah, this is not healthy at all, and I imagine what Kyle's experiencing is a healthy degree of throttling to keep this in check. If we're running at 80 plus Celsius in the BIOS, trying to even open a game in Windows is probably cooking this. Look at that, almost 90 degrees Celsius. It's just been chilling here. And so when it drops down like this, again, I think that's just the V-core dropping. I think it's lowering voltage, lowering frequency. 90 degrees Celsius, that is nuts. It does load into Windows very quickly, but at this point I don't see a reason to keep the system on any longer. It's just gonna be suffering, baking itself. I don't wanna risk further damage. Now, a normal healthy system will throttle itself into oblivion if it detects that the CPU is running way too hot. It'll drop V-core, it'll drop frequency to a point, and if it can't drop those anymore while the temps remain very high, then it will just shut off in an effort to save itself. That's a healthy procedure for any overheating PC. What I'm confused with at this point is why this system, if it is in fact overheating, would trip a breaker in a house. Like, why is it pulling that much power to trip a breaker if it's actually consuming less power since it's throttling down? To me, those two aren't really adding up. I've asked Kyle to bring the cable that he uses to plug his system into the wall. I don't suspect there's any wiring issue at the house where he lives because, well, he hasn't had an issue to date. The only thing he's done is vacuum the system. So maybe the temperature issue is unrelated to the vacuuming and the potential shorting of something power supply related. I'm also slightly concerned with the fact that this power supply fan hasn't spun a single time since arriving in the office. Even if this unit has an RPM cutoff feature below a certain power threshold, we should still see the fan spin once or twice upon initial boot. That's usually the unit's way of checking that the fan is okay. Because if this power supply experiences a heavy load, the internals get hot, and this fan doesn't kick in, maybe that could explain why a breaker's tripping? We may learn more about this potential issue a bit later. One thing's for sure, this CPU is running far too hot. I can tell you the block is mounted correctly. We are getting contact with the IHS. There's enough mounting pressure here. The screws aren't loose, and we know for a fact that the fan over the radiator is spinning. The pump is also spinning. I can feel fluid churning, though it's not very strong, and there's a lot of heat buildup in one of these pipes. In fact, one of these is still very hot. I think we have a clog in the block. Unfortunately, there's only one way to really find out, and that's to disassemble the loop, which involves draining a closed system. It's gonna be difficult to refill. We might have to just replace the AIO anyway. And again, we've seen this on the channel. It looks like oftentimes jelly that just fills up inside these micro fin stacks just above the cold plate. This is to increase surface area for the fluid to pull heat away from the chip. If any of these is clogged, then the AIO by definition becomes less efficient.
Is water in there?
Yeah. It's like a water glycol solution.
I'm glad I didn't pull any of it apart.
So the reason why we use water, usually it's a water base with like some kind of glycol additive or something, anti-corrosion, corrosion inhibitors, etc., is because water has a really high heat capacity. And so when the chip gets really hot,
why not just use oil?
Oil doesn't have as...
Like a form of oil that's...
Oil, as far as I'm aware, oil doesn't have as high of a heat capacity as water does. Really? So that is one of water's very unique characteristics, is the fact that it can handle a lot of heat without itself getting too hot. So you could dump a ton of energy into water, and water will stay relatively cool.
So we use water for nuclear reactors?
We use water for nuclear reactors. That's exactly why we do. But yeah, that's why we use it. Water is it's also plentiful. That helps as well. But it's the heat capacity that makes water so incredible from a physics standpoint, and that's why it's in even cars. You can cool cars with water. Once water boils in a loop, you're screwed. That's why you don't want your water temps in a car to get over like 210 degrees.
In the the Chernobyl reactor. Nothing was really kinked anywhere like a water hose.
Yeah.
Nothing was kinked, everything was flowing.
Yeah, and these are really difficult to kink. That's by design.
Yeah,
so like in these tighter kind of cases, it's very difficult to bend these so much to the point where you don't get flow. Yeah.
And I noticed that when I was looking. That's why I figured like anything else that was more with it, I was like, just let you deal with it. It's like if I try to touch any more.
That would also put a lot of pressure on the pump. Now, these pumps are really weak to begin with, but then when you create a blockage like that, that's that strong, it'll cook the pump. All right, so we've got this out. We're gonna take this apart. I just wanna quickly assess all of your other connections in here. I wanna make sure that everything is sound. Your 24 pins good. 8-pin EPS is good. I checked your graphics card supplemental PCI cables already. Those looked fine. The smaller stuff shouldn't be affecting anything major. Now this NZXT AIO is a bit special. Most of these products would have their pumps baked into these blocks here, but this one has it baked into the fin stack of the radiator. Just something to point out. I have seen products like these clog prematurely. I think they're manufactured in a different place. They're not using like the conventional Asetek style design, and the coolant in them especially is prone to just creating debris. There's like galvanic corrosion and stuff, bacteria that builds up in them. They're just not treated properly from the factory. So let's start with this pump side here. If we do have debris in the loop, there might be some of it in the pump housing. Looks like 4 Torx screws. I'm assuming it's gonna be like a, let's see if it's a T9. Yep, that's about right. All right, now if we lift this up, we're gonna break that seal. Some coolant may come out. Yep. Alrighty, so first glance on this side, it's a bit discolored. That's mildly concerning. Thankfully, NZXT doesn't deploy tamper screws like we've seen with some of the other clogged loops. Oh yeah, look at that. The color of the fluid is just disgusting. Oh yeah, yeah. That's a clog right there. That's the forbidden jelly. Yeah, this thing is cooked, dude.
What is that?
That's supposed to be empty because the fluid comes.
Dude, it looks like salmon.
Yeah, the fluid comes into there and then it gets pushed through all these tiny microscopic fins to the outsides and then gets pushed through the radiator to cool itself off. So all these tiny fins are making contact with the coolant, right? But they can't make contact with the coolant because it's all clogged. You maybe get like 10% flow in there. Yeah. So like immediately you're getting like no flow. Plus this color is disgusting. That tells me that you've got some sort of growth in here. It looks like growth to me. This is a textbook clogged AIO, folks. So we're getting very, very little flow here, if any at all, which would definitely explain why his CPU temps were so high, even in the BIOS where it should be otherwise idle. This is so bad. Kind of not surprised based on that initial symptom that we saw, but it does kind of suck at the same time because this is an NZXT product and it shouldn't be doing this early in its life cycle. The other telltale sign, the discoloration of this coolant, and we saw this initially in the pump housing, I don't think it ships from the factory this color. And this is likely either the result of galvanic corrosion, something that should be inhibited by the coolant itself, or some sort of bacterial or algae growth. Again, should be inhibited by the coolant if it's treated properly from the factory. This very clearly was not. It's like this jelly substance, and it comes up fairly easily at least, and this is something to be clear that we could probably clean. If we took vinegar or something like that that could eat through whatever this buildup is, and we flush the loop with it as well, then we could potentially refill the entire thing with maybe distilled water, include some additives, but at this point it's just really not worth the hassle. I'd rather switch Kyle to air cooling so that something like this doesn't happen again. Now I don't recall what CPU I gave Kyle. This again, this system's maybe a few years old. I think it's a Ryzen 7 3700X, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of staining on this chip. Wow, probably due in part to the excessive heat this thing has experienced. The good thing is the system's still post, so I don't see any initial reason to replace the CPU. It's a 2700X. Okay, so Zen Plus, and it's paired with an X470 motherboard. Kyle, how long have you been seeing abnormally high CPU temps, like what we just saw in the BIOS, if you had to wager? Because this, you've got like, this paste is cooked into this IHS. I don't think I've ever seen this before.
Probably like 5 to 6 months.
6 months running at 90+ degrees Celsius at idle. That hurts my heart a little bit. Yeah, dude, you've got some serious staining on this IHS. One thing's for sure, you're probably gonna see a huge performance uplift when we rectify this, because with your CPU throttled as much as I imagine it was, you were probably running somewhere around like 2000 megahertz, whatever the bottom limit is. And so when this is allowed to fully stretch its legs, you're probably gonna see a nice uplift. So that's another benefit of this, not only preventing impending doom, nuclear meltdown, but you should see a decent FPS pump as well. So we're going to carefully remove this platform, and we'll fit a new CPU cooler, and we'll probably add a bit more storage as well, because, you know, Black Ops 6 is a pretty large game. Kyle only has 500 gigs of storage in total currently, which is good enough for about one Call of Duty game. So I'm gonna give him another 500 gigs here. That'll make it 1 terabyte in total. Good enough for maybe another 1 to 2 games. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna be switching him to an air-based CPU cooling solution so that something like, well, this doesn't happen again. It's very sad to see this happen as frequently as it does in this playlist, and I imagine this is affecting many more people than we realize. I think folks are running AIOs like this that are already clogged and not noticing it. They're maybe not monitoring CPU temperatures, maybe they're seeing a small performance hit, but they're not thinking to check CPU temps, and they're not expecting an AIO like theirs to clog as early as it does. So switching to an air cooler is just gonna completely remove that possibility. It's gonna give Kyle peace of mind long term. And this P-Rock LP from Be Quiet might seem a bit underkill for Ryzen 7 2700X. Remember, these Ryzen chips are fairly power efficient. They don't tend to run super hot unless, again, instances like what we just saw are occurring. And we're also gonna be able to supplement this cooler with an additional 140mm fan above it for an ultimate top flow experience. First gonna apply some Thermal Grizzly thermal paste. And installation is very straightforward. It helps to flip everything upside down. Just 4 Phillips screws will tighten it all in place. Make sure the fan cable is connected. And here we are, a much more tame, low profile, air-based cooling solution that thankfully won't clog. You can learn more about the P-Rock LP by clicking the link in this video's description. I want to thank Be Quiet for being a continued product sponsor of this Fix or Flop playlist. Conveniently, also helps my brother in the process, and I think Be Quiet makes some of the best products in the business, so it's great to be partnered with a brand like them. And I know, again, some of you are still hesitant about the size of this. At 100 watt TDP, it's gonna be enough for 2700X, maybe not for overclocking, but in a smaller case like this with minimal ventilation anyway, I wouldn't advise overclocking. So we'll drop the platform back in very carefully. There's not a lot of space to work with in here. Get it aligned with the rear IO shield. Looks something like that. And even with this top panel closed, you'll see we'll have just enough space for a 25 or 30 mil thick 140 mil fan. I'm also installing the 140 mil chassis fan. I only had white 140s for some reason. At least this one though is from NZXT, sticking with the theme of the case. Also don't want to forget this extra SSD. So that slots in toolless. And lastly, we'll get this cover installed to clean it all up. You can see there's roughly an inch or about 2.5 or so centimeters of clearance between the top of our CPU cooler and the base of our 140 mil fan. I don't think these are close enough to create a ton of turbulence. It might run a tad bit louder, but I'll take this for peace of mind any day. In fact, compared to how loud this thing was running when it first showed up in the office, it should be running way quieter now. Also gonna take a second to clean up this disgusting goop. Here we are then. We're gonna power this up, hop into the BIOS firstly, and make sure that idle CPU temps are in check this time around. I'm expecting somewhere between 30 and 40-ish degrees Celsius. Then we'll open up a game and again, confirm there that CPU temps are not egregious. I'm still very concerned about the breaker tripping issue. And again, I have no way of knowing if that's actually correlated with the temperature problem that we saw. One thing's for sure though, that temperature issue needed to be rectified, and I'm hoping that it has been with what we've done. So let's confirm first that we're not seeing 80 degrees Celsius plus in the BIOS. Just gonna adjust a few fan curves here, and this is much better than where we started. Low 40 Celsius, nothing wrong with that at near idle conditions. And again, we're using a very small, densely packed case, and so I don't expect this to be, you know, super chilly. But what we're gonna check for now when we load up a game is how high this goes. I'm also gonna do 2 other things in the meantime. Firstly, I'm gonna enable DOCP, which wasn't on when Kyle brought the system to me. That's gonna help his performance a bit. This is Zen Plus after all. And I'm going to undervolt his CPU. These chips tend to have a bit of leeway there. I think somewhere around 1.2 to 1.25 V-core should do the trick. Starting first with a quick sanity check, the loading screen or the main menu of Call of Duty. You can see our CPU temperatures are significantly lower here than they were previously. In fact, if you recall, the breaker tripped while the game was simply searching for a lobby to join. He wasn't actually in a game yet. Kyle wasn't, on the keyboard and mouse, moving around his character or anything like that. He was just in the main menu trying to find a game. That's where it crashed. You can see here around 50 to 55 degrees Celsius for our CPU temps under a menu sort of load. The frame rate's still extremely high. This is so much better than where we started. But of course, we have to go deeper. And so I physically jumped into a game. Granted, in this clip here, you're seeing I'm not actually moving around physically in the game. That was done by Kyle in later clips that you'll see, and some B-roll as well. But we still didn't see any issues. The system didn't crash. Obviously, it had no reason to, at least from what I could tell. Those temperatures at the top left corner of the screen are so much better now, especially on the CPU side. So why would the system throttle? Why would it crash, right? There's no reason to, because the CPU is so much cooler now. And that's exactly what we were looking for. Ultimately, Kyle played an entire Warzone session without issue. Temperatures were all in check. The game didn't crash. My breaker didn't trip. That was something I was really worried about in the background, but I didn't have any electrical issues on my end. The power supply seemed to be running totally fine. In fact, the fan in that unit did kick in, finally. I don't know why it wasn't upon initial boot like most other units I've seen, but this fan finally did turn on after a while, after being under a fairly heavy load while gaming, and well, that was a breath of fresh air. I also connected a watt meter to the system to see just how much power it was pulling from the wall. I was curious if it was going to be pulling, crazy high wattage just intermittently. Maybe that would explain why the breaker at his house was tripping, but everything was smooth on my end. I saw somewhere between 200 and 250 watts of power draw under that gaming load. I suspect a majority of that's coming from the graphics card. Despite gaming in 1080p, Kyle likes to use a very high or extreme graphical preset, which of course will stress the graphics card a bit more. These have been known to run a tad hot, these 6800s and 6900 XTs, and they do consume quite a bit of power, but at the end of the day, I don't see anything alarming from a power draw perspective. Of course, temperatures on the graphics card side are still fine. They were to begin with, even with the side panels on. Kyle also noticed his frame rate was around 20 to 30% higher in Warzone, whereas before I think he again was being heavily throttled on the CPU side. It wasn't allowed to fully stretch its legs despite running at a higher in-game preset. The CPU still is involved, and so having that as a severe bottleneck, running as hot as it did, will definitely affect performance like we said. So gaining 20 to 30 FPS or more in some cases simply by swapping a clogged AIO for a pretty compact air cooler is a big win in my book. I did do a bit of research off camera into the correlation between high CPU and GPU temperatures and a breaker tripping, which again is pretty foreign to me. I've heard of systems completely shutting off, maybe blue screening during a severe throttling session, but I've never heard of a breaker tripping. And it sounds to me like either the breaker itself is too sensitive, maybe it's seeing these tiny micro spikes in power draw from the power supply, and they're tripping as a result of that. It's honestly way above my pay grade. Electrical circuits was my worst class in school, so I will defer to the experts on that one. Maybe someone can shed some light in the comment section below. But what I can say is that what I'm seeing now is a very stable system, very stable temperatures, very smooth playback, apart from some networking issues I think that are on COD's side. Kyle is running off of Wi-Fi here in my house, but I have very smooth connections here. I play games all the time on my own systems, even wirelessly, and don't experience those stutters. We also monitored frame times during these gaming sessions and didn't see any unreasonable spikes that would suggest it was a frame rate issue. So I think it just comes down to networking. COD servers have been kind of bogged down lately with the release of Black Ops 6. Hopefully those will be smoothed out in the coming days. Otherwise, Kyle is going to be driven absolutely mad. My advice to you at this point, Kyle, would be to plug this back in at your place. Leave everything the way that we've set it up here, especially on the BIOS side. Don't clear the CMOS or anything, and see if that breaker trips again. If it does, I would say that's more a breaker house electrical wiring issue than a PC issue. Because again, from what I'm seeing here, it's running fine, it's running smoothly, it's not pulling an unreasonable amount of power from the wall, and it runs a lot quieter now than it used to as well. So yeah, this won't be going near a PC anytime soon. I do want to point out again, it is easy to clean these, to flush them out with something like vinegar. Make sure that all of the fins, especially the pump housing, the block, the fin stack there, are all deep cleaned, reassembled, and then refilled with treated distilled water with additives that'll prevent things like galvanic corrosion and algae and bacteria buildup. that should keep something like this from happening again. Is it worth going through the trouble? Up to some. I'm not just gonna toss something out like this. It's still worth about maybe 60 to 80 bucks, maybe not used, but to someone it will make for a good home. I think it's a pretty cool design, the fact that we have such a low profile block because the pump is in the radiator. It's just unfortunate that this design from this manufacturer and coolant supplier is often plagued with clogging issues. I was also sure to configure and set up a simple volume for that second storage drive we added. I just called it games because I imagine that's for what it will be mostly used. Thank you so much for watching this first episode of season 6 of Fix or Flop. I didn't expect my brother to be a candidate, especially not for a rig that I built him. It's a bit of a shame, but at least I can say that it wasn't something I did myself. I mean, the fact that we used an AIO that shipped with this case, it was just a bit of an unfortunate coincidence that it happened to kick the can. But thankfully there's enough room in this, what is this, an H1? Is that what they call this? H1, NZXT H1? I can't remember the name of the chassis, but this does have enough room in it for a replacement cooler that doesn't necessarily have to be an AIO. And so we shouldn't have these clogging issues anymore. And I'd be willing to bet that the breaker tripping issue has very little, if anything, to do at all with this system. It seems very healthy. It plays games just fine and also runs much, much quieter. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. Click that red button. That would do me a huge favor. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about this one. Maybe some pointers, some tips, maybe things you've seen yourself that could kind of assess this situation a bit better, at least on the breaker side of things. And consider sticking around for the next one. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning.